Okay, last but not least is the cerebrum. The cerebrum is our most complex portion of the brain. It contains what we call our higher mental processes. So it's going to contain a lot of intelligence, communication, our ability to communicate with one another, learning and memory, reasoning, and emotions. So these are considered our higher mental capabilities. Kind of what distinguishes us from other organisms is our more developed cerebrum. It interprets sensory input. So this is a major function of the cerebrum. So many and almost all of our senses end up going to the cerebrum, where the cerebrum is going to analyze and process that information and then initiate voluntary skeletal movements. So when you move an arm, a leg, a finger, your head voluntarily, that is emanating from the cerebrum. So those are some major functions. Conscious thought, memory, regulation of skeletal muscles. So the cerebrum, like many parts of the brain, is subdivided into areas. The outer layer, so the more superficial gray matter, is called the cerebral cortex, also called the cortical area. So again, cortex and cortical both mean an outer layer. So the outer layer of the cerebrum is gray matter. And when we look at a section through the cerebrum, we'll see that the gray matter is on the outside, the white matter is more on the inside. So this gray matter is going to integrate sensory information. Integrate meaning analyzing it, interpreting it. If we've got some memory, using our memory to help interpret that sensory information. It's going to initiate motor output as well. So those are two big functions. It's got emotions, intellect as well. Buried inside is some other regions where you're going to find gray matter called basal ganglia. We're not going to talk too much about the details of all these ganglia, but the ganglia are kind of masses of gray matter that lie within, deep inside the hemispheres. And what these basal nuclei or ganglia do is provide more of the subconscious control of skeletal muscle, whereas the outer gray matter is more of the voluntary control. So those are deep masses of gray matter. They also have involvement in the limbic system. The limbic system is a group of areas in the brain, primarily in the cerebrum, but also in the diencephalon. But this limbic system is more of our emotional brain. So notice, quote unquote, emotional brain. So pleasure and punishment and emotions. White matter, like the spinal cord's white matter, are loads of myelinated axons which send the information in and out of the brain within the brain. So this is deep to the cortex, so most of the inside of the cerebrum is white matter. Again, myelinated axons. But there's really three types of tracks. So a lot like the spinal cord, we have tracks where information is going to specific regions. So we have what's called association fibers or fiber tracks. That means the information, the impulses, the action potentials are traveling within the same hemisphere. So we have a right and left hemisphere of our cerebrum. And if information is traveling within one hemisphere, it's in these association fibers. Kamashura fibers transmit between the two hemispheres. So this basically connects the right and left hemispheres together. So the right and left hemispheres can send information back and forth. And then finally you have projection fibers. This is how information gets in and out of the cerebrum. Ascending and descending tracks in and out of the cerebrum. The major Kamashura fiber track is known as the corpus callosum. We'll be able to identify that in our brain models. But it's a major track of which information can travel between the two hemispheres. So that's kind of the big picture of our cerebrum. There's also a lot of anatomical features of the cerebrum, both looking from within but also surface features. So what we're going to do here is just go over some of the anatomy that we're going to be looking for in class. If we were to take a brain from the outside, let's look at some of these features. So this is kind of what a brain looks like, right? We have all these grooves and crevices on the outside, and these all have certain names. So, and then there's also lobes. So we have what's called the frontal lobe. So here's the frontal lobe of the brain. We've heard that word frontal before because the frontal bone covers and protects the frontal lobe. There's a temporal lobe. So that's on the lateral sides. There's a parietal, I should say two of each of these, right and left. There's parietal lobes. There's an occipital lobes in the back, posterior. There's also a lobe buried inside. You kind of see it projected, meaning you can almost see deep inside the brain. There's what's called the insula lobe, which is another lobe, but you can only see that if you open up a brain and look inside. Then there's some grooves and crevices. So we have some shallow grooves known as sulci or a sulcus. All right, we've learned that term before when we studied bones. So you've got some shallow grooves. You also have some deep slits called fissures. So grooves, there's a major one called the central sulcus. So that central sulcus is right here. It in essence is a groove that separates the frontal lobes from the parietal lobes. So there's the central sulcus. The folds that you can see, which are usually on each side of a groove, are called a gyri or a gyrus. Gyri are plural, gyrus is singular. So we have what's called a precentral gyrus, pre meaning in front of and before, and then it's before the central sulcus. So if you find the central sulcus, there's a fold in front of it, known as the precentral gyrus. There's a fold behind it, known as the postcentral gyrus. So these are all anatomical words. We're going to learn the function of many of these when we come into class. There's a lateral cerebral sulcus, so it's another groove, and this groove separates the frontal from the temporal lobe. So there's a distinct groove here. I know I'm kind of making a mess of it, but we'll find that groove in class. There's a transverse fissure, so a fissure is deeper than a sulcus. So there's a deep groove in between the cerebellum, which is here, and the cerebrum. So that's a deeper slit, fissure, transverse fissure. There's a longitudinal fissure as well, so this is a deeper slit. A longitudinal fissure divides the brain into right and left hemispheres. So we're looking, this is a superior view looking down at the brain. And we see the frontal lobes, we see the parietal lobes, we see the occipital lobes. Again, here's the central sulcus, a groove dividing frontal and parietal. And then in front of this groove is the precentral gyrus. Behind the groove is the postcentral gyrus. So those are going to be important for us, because if we know where those are, when we start talking about functional areas, and I say, well, look at the precentral gyrus, it does this, you'll know where to locate that. Here's just a little chunk taken out, so you notice they took a little chunk of the brain here and we're looking at it. Notice we can see that the outer, more superficial layer is gray matter, so that's the cerebral cortex. Deep inside is the white matter, and you can imagine there might be some basal ganglia deeper inside the white matter. So when we come into class, we're going to pick up on slide 10. We're going to be talking about some of the functional areas of the cerebral cortex. So knowing the anatomy, knowing these gyri and lobes, we're going to try to find specific functional areas when we get into class.